The Galactic Academy of Higher Learning, perched on Academicus Prime like a monument to intellectual superiority, its crystalline spires reaching toward stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Though if you asked anyone within those hallowed halls, they'd insist that true civilization had only begun when the Academy opened its doors 5 centuries ago. The institution's founding charter, carved in quantum-stable matter and displayed prominently in the main atrium, proclaimed its mission to preserve and disseminate the totality of galactic knowledge to worthy minds across the known system. The irony of this statement would become apparent soon enough, though none of the distinguished faculty suspected it yet. Professor Henley Blackthorne adjusted his ceremonial robes, a flowing arrangement of shimmering fabric that cost more than most planets' annual education budgets, surveyed his lecture hall with the satisfied expression of someone who had never encountered a question he couldn't answer with supreme confidence. At 743 years old, he represented the pinnacle of Altarian intellectual achievement, a species whose cranial capacity had evolved specifically to accommodate vast stores of knowledge and an even vaster sense of their own importance. His 3-meter frame cast an impressive shadow over the assembled students, and his 6 eyes could simultaneously track every corner of the room, ensuring that no one dared to look anything less than appropriately awed by his presence. The lecture hall itself was a marvel of academic architecture, designed to invoke feelings of scholarly inadequacy in anyone who entered. Holographic displays showed the swirling dance of galaxies, quantum equations floated through the air like mathematical poetry, and the very walls seemed to hum with the accumulated wisdom of ages. The seating arrangement followed a strict hierarchy. Core world species occupied the front row, mid-rim civilizations clustered in the center, and outer rim species, those lucky enough to have discovered faster-than-light travel recently enough to matter, huddled in the back like academic afterthought. Today's gathering represented the cream of galactic society's offspring, or at least those whose parents possessed enough influence or currency to secure admission. There was Dendrick of House Vorthak, whose draconian heritage was evident in both his scaled hide and his tendency to literally breathe fire when frustrated with particularly difficult concepts. The Crystalian delegation sat in perfect geometric formation, their silicon-based forms refracting the ambient light into dazzling patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so smugly aware of their own aesthetic superiority. A cluster of aquatic Zenithians had constructed a mobile water environment that allowed them to attend lectures while maintaining their dignity, though the constant bubbling provided an unwelcome soundtrack to Professor Blackthorne's carefully modulated speeches. But it was the lone figure in the back corner that drew the most curious glances, not because she was particularly remarkable in appearance, but because she represented something unprecedented in the Academy's distinguished history. The human exchange student sat quietly, taking notes with an archaic writing implement on actual paper, a practice that several species found so primitive they had initially assumed it was some form of performance art. Her acceptance into the program had caused considerable controversy in academic circles, with many questioning whether a species that had barely managed to crawl beyond their own solar system could possibly contribute anything meaningful to galactic discourse. The human's presence had been the subject of heated debate in faculty lounges across 3 sectors. Some professors viewed it as an amusing experiment, like teaching complex mathematics to a particularly clever pet. Others worried that lowering admission standards for diversity purposes would compromise the Academy's reputation. Professor Blackthorne fell into a third category entirely. He saw her as an opportunity to demonstrate the vast gulf between true galactic civilization and the fumbling efforts of primitive worlds still struggling with concepts like interstellar travel and basic energy manipulation. Today marks the culmination of your studies in universal galactic history, Professor Blackthorne announced, his voice carrying the resonant authority of someone who had never been contradicted by anyone whose opinion mattered. In 1 week you will face the comprehensive examination that will determine whether you possess the intellectual capacity to join the ranks of certified galactic historians, or whether you will return to your respective worlds as educated, but ultimately inadequate observers of events beyond your comprehension. The examination format had remained unchanged since the Academy's founding, a tradition that Professor Blackthorne defended with religious fervor. Students would be required to present a comprehensive thesis on the Great Transition period, demonstrating their understanding of how the galaxy had evolved from a collection of isolated worlds into the unified civilization they knew today. The topic encompassed everything from the development of hyperspace technology to the establishment of the Galactic Republic, the standardization of temporal measurements, and the creation of universal trade protocol. Your thesis must demonstrate mastery of the fundamental forces that shaped our current reality. He continued, his multiple eyes scanning the room for signs of inadequate attention. You must understand the delicate balance of power that maintains galactic stability, the economic systems that enable interstellar commerce, and the diplomatic frameworks that prevent the kinds of primitive conflicts that once plagued individual worlds before they achieved true civilization. The students dutifully recorded his words, though several displayed the telltale signs of academic anxiety that preceded major examinations across all known species. The draconian scales had shifted to a nervous purple. The crystallion's geometric formations had become slightly less perfect, and one of the aquatic zenithians was producing an unusual number of stress bubbles. Professor Blackthorne paused at the humans section of the seating area, his expression mixing curiosity with the kind of patronizing concern typically reserved for mentally deficient relatives. I trust our exchange student understands the significance of this examination, he said, his tone carefully modulated to sound helpful rather than condescending, though achieving the opposite effect entirely. Given the limited historical perspective available to species for its developing systems, I would encourage focusing on the more accessible aspects of galactic development, perhaps the establishment of standard timekeeping or the basic principles of hyperspace navigation. The suggestion drew a few barely suppressed snickers from the more socially prominent students, though whether from genuine amusement or nervous sycophancy was difficult to determine. The human, however, simply nodded politely and continued taking her peculiar handwritten notes, seemingly oblivious to the implied insult or choosing to ignore it entirely. The examination will begin at the standard temporal marker next week, Professor Blackthorne concluded, his robes billowing dramatically as he moved toward the exit. I suggest you use the intervening period to review the foundational texts and prepare presentations worthy of this institution's reputation. Remember, you are not merely students of history, you are the inheritors of galactic civilization itself. As the lecture hall began to empty, conversations buzzed with the typical pre-examination anxiety mixed with the peculiar brand of intellectual competition that characterized advanced academic institutions. Species clustered according to their traditional alliances, sharing study strategies and forming temporary alliances, designed to maximize their collective chances of success. The human remained seated long after the others had departed, still writing in her notebook with that primitive instrument, occasionally pausing to stare thoughtfully at the holographic displays showing the current political map of the galaxy. If anyone had bothered to ask what she was thinking about, they might have been surprised by the answer, but no one asked because in the rarefied atmosphere of the Galactic Academy of Higher Learning, it was simply assumed that some questions weren't worth asking, and some perspectives weren't worth considering. That assumption was about to be tested in ways that would fundamentally challenge everything the Academy thought it knew about the nature of universal knowledge. The pre-examination briefing session, 3 days later, carried all the ceremonial weight of a religious gathering, complete with the kind of hushed reverence typically reserved for matters of cosmic significance. Professor Blackthorne had donned his most elaborate academic regalia for the occasion, robes that seemed to incorporate the light of distant nebulae and a ceremonial headdress that added another half-meter to his already imposing. The assembled students occupied their assigned positions with the solemnity of condemned prisoners awaiting final sentencing, which, given the Academy's failure rates, wasn't entirely inaccurate. The Great Transition Period, Professor Blackthorne intoned, his voice echoing through the hall with practiced gravitas, represents the most crucial epoch in galactic development. Your examination will require you to demonstrate comprehensive understanding of how our galaxy evolved from primitive chaos into the ordered civilization we inhabit today. He gestured grandly at a holographic timeline that materialized above the students, displaying the past 500 years in meticulous detail, star charts, political boundaries, trade routes, and technological milestones arranged in perfect chronological order. The timeline was, by any measure, an impressive piece of academic construction. It showed the gradual expansion of what would become the Galactic Republic, the establishment of hyperspace trade networks, the development of universal translation protocols, and the creation of standardized governmental structures that allowed thousands of species to coexist in relative harmony. Each major event was cross-referenced with supporting documentation, economic data, and cultural impact assessments, that would have made lesser institutions weep within. Your presentations must address the fundamental question of governmental evolution. The professor continued, his 6 eyes sweeping the room with the intensity of someone who had never encountered a concept he couldn't categorize and file away neatly. How did we transition from isolated planetary governments to our current unified republic? What forces drove this inevitable progression toward galactic civilization? What lessons can we extract from this period to ensure continued stability and progress? Several students nodded with the kind of determined understanding that suggested they had already begun mentally organizing their responses into academically acceptable framework. The draconian delegation had shifted to their traditional deep thought purple, while the Crystalians had arranged themselves into geometric patterns that apparently facilitated collective reasoning, though to outside observers, it looked more like an exercise in competitive interior decorating. It was at this moment of peak academic solemnity that the human in the back corner raised her hand. The gesture itself was unremarkable, a simple extension of one appendage to indicate a desire to speak. But in the context of Professor Blackthorn's carefully orchestrated briefing, it carried the disruptive force of a small supernova. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned with the mechanical precision of automated tracking systems, and even the aquatic Xenesian's perpetual bubbling seemed to pause in anticipation. Professor Blackthorn's expression cycled through several distinct phases: surprise that anyone would interrupt his presentation, mild annoyance at the breach of protocol, and finally a kind of patronizing patience reserved for addressing the intellectually disadvantaged. "Yes?" he inquired, his tone suggesting that whatever question was forthcoming would likely be both simple and irrelevant. "I just want to clarify the scope of the examination," the human said, her voice carrying none of the deferential uncertainty that typically characterized student inquiry. "When you refer to the Great Transition Period in governmental evolution, are you asking us to analyze this from the Republic's fall, or the Empire?" The silence that followed was not the comfortable quiet of academic contemplation, but the profound stillness that occurs when reality encounters something it cannot immediately process. Professor Blackthorn's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, as if trying to reset his visual processing system. Several students exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of confusion and second-hand embarrassment, while others simply stared at the human with the kind of fascination typically reserved for witnessing natural disasters. "I beg your pardon?" Professor Blackthorn managed, his voice carrying just a hint of the bewilderment he was desperately trying to suppress. "Well, you're asking about governmental transitions in the evolution from republic to presumably something else," the human continued with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she was unaware she had just committed academic heresy. "But historically speaking, that's happened multiple times. In the specific context determines which analytical framework would be most appropriate. Are we discussing the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Empire under Augustus? Or perhaps the dissolution of the Weimar Republic and the establishment of the Third Reich? The collapse of the French Directory and Napoleon's rise to power? The transition from the Republic of China to the People's Republic? There are so many examples that I wanted to make sure I understood which particular case study you had in mind." The holographic timeline above them seemed to flicker slightly, as if the technology itself was struggling to process this unexpected input. Professor Blackthorn's elaborate headdress tilted at an angle that suggested his entire worldview was undergoing structural realignment. That is to say," the professor began, then stopped, his usual eloquence apparently having abandoned him at a crucial moment. "We are discussing galactic history, the transition from planetary isolation to galactic unity, the only such transition in recorded galactic history." "Oh," the human said, with the kind of gentle understanding typically used when explaining basic concepts to children. "You mean you're only looking at the current galactic government? But that's just one data point, isn't it? I mean, for comparative analysis, you'd want to examine multiple examples of similar transitions to identify patterns and predict future development." A small commotion erupted in the Crystalian section as their geometric formation suddenly collapsed into chaos, apparently the silicon-based equivalent of a collective mental breakdown. One of the aquatic Xenethians released a stream of bubbles that roughly translated to a series of expletives in 12 different languages. "Multiple examples," Professor Blackthorn repeated slowly,
as if testing the words for some hidden meaning that might restore order to his carefully structured universe. From Earth's history alone, we've had dozens of republics that transitioned to empires, monarchies that became republics, empires that fragmented into city-states, and city-states that consolidated into federations. The human explained with the patient tone of someone providing helpful clarification. The patterns are actually quite fascinating from a cyclical perspective. Governments tend to follow predictable trajectories based on economic pressures, military necessities, and social evolution. I assumed that's what the examination was designed to test. Our ability to recognize these patterns and apply historical precedent to predict future development. The lecture hall had achieved a level of silence previously thought impossible outside of deep space vacuum chambers. Professor Blackthorne stood frozen like a monument to academic certainty, suddenly confronted with the possibility that certainty itself might be a relative concept. "You're suggesting," he said carefully, "that your planet has experienced governmental transitions comparable to our current galactic situation." "Oh, constantly," the human replied cheerfully. "We're actually quite good at it by now, though we do tend to make the same mistakes repeatedly, which I suppose is why studying comparative governmental evolution is so important. You can identify the warning signs and maybe avoid the more catastrophic transition." The implications of this statement began to percolate through the assembled students like a cognitive virus. If this primitive species had experienced multiple governmental transitions, what did that suggest about the inevitability of change in their own perfect galactic system? If patterns existed that could predict such transitions, why hadn't the Academy's distinguished faculty identified them? Most disturbing of all, if the Academy's comprehensive examination was designed to test understanding of universal principles, how had they managed to overlook the experiences of entire civilization? Professor Blackthorne's ceremonial robes suddenly seemed less impressive and more like an elaborate costume designed to disguise the fact that the Emperor of Galactic Knowledge might not be wearing any clothes at all.
What happened next would later be recorded in Academy archives under the euphemistic heading, Spontaneous Educational Realignment Event, though those present would remember it more accurately, as the day a single human demolished 5 centuries of academic smugness with nothing more than a basic understanding of cyclical governmental patterns. Professor Blackthorne, demonstrating the kind of intellectual flexibility that had made him legendary in faculty circles for entirely different reasons, decided to treat this unexpected development as a teaching moment. Unfortunately for his reputation, he chose to be the student rather than the teacher. "Perhaps you could elaborate on these patterns you mentioned," he said, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone trying to maintain dignity while standing in quicksand, "for the benefit of your fellow students, of course." The human glanced around the lecture hall, apparently noticing for the first time that several hundred of the galaxy's most privileged minds were staring at her with the kind of intense focus typically reserved for observing rare astronomical phenomena. "Well, if you're sure," she said, rising from her seat with the unhurried confidence of someone about to explain why water runs downhill. "The basic pattern is actually quite straightforward," she began, moving toward the front of the hall as if she had been invited to deliver a guest lecture rather than accidentally triggered an academic crisis. "Governments tend to follow predictable cycles based on their internal contradictions and external pressures. Take the Roman Republic, for instance. It worked brilliantly for local governance and regional expansion, but the very success that made it powerful also made it ungovernable." She gestured toward the holographic timeline still floating above the lecture hall, though now it seemed less like a comprehensive historical record and more like a child's drawing of what history might look like if it had only started paying attention yesterday. "The Republic's expansion created wealth disparities that destabilized the political system. Military commanders gained personal loyalty from their legions, making them more powerful than civilian authority. The Senate became gridlocked between competing factions, making decisive action impossible during crises." Sound familiar? She glanced meaningfully at the current galactic political map displayed alongside the timeline. Uncomfortable stirring rippled through the student body as several dozen highly educated minds began making connections their professors had somehow missed. The Draconian delegation had shifted to an alarmed orange, while the Crystalians were attempting to reform their geometric patterns into configurations that might help them process this unwelcome information. The transition to empire was almost inevitable. The human continued, apparently unaware that she was systematically deconstructing the foundational assumptions of galactic political science. Augustus didn't seize power through military conquest. He was invited to take control by a Senate that could no longer govern effectively. The empire provided stability and efficient administration, but at the cost of representative governance and individual freedom. Professor Blackthorn's 6 eyes had developed a glazed quality suggesting that his cognitive processing centers were operating at maximum capacity and still falling behind. But surely, he managed, such primitive governmental systems have no relevance to our current galactic civilization. Actually, you're displaying several classic warning signs. The human replied with the helpful tone of a physician delivering a routine diagnosis. Economic inequality between core and rim worlds, increasing military autonomy in frontier regions, legislative gridlock in the Galactic Senate, and growing calls for emergency powers during successive crises. Based on Earth's historical precedents, you're probably about 2 decades away from someone offering to temporarily assume additional authority for the good of galactic stability. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the sound of the aquatic Cenithian's emergency bubble release system activating automatically. Somewhere in the back rows, a student's translation device began emitting what could only be described as mechanical sobbing. Of course, it doesn't have to follow that exact pattern, the human added reassuringly. The Chinese imperial system lasted over 2 millennia by institutionalizing dynastic transitions, though they had to deal with periodic collapses and reconstruction. The British managed to evolve from absolute monarchy to constitutional democracy without major revolutionary upheaval, though that took several centuries and a few civil wars. The key is recognizing where you are in the cycle and implementing reforms before crisis forces change upon you. A trembling hand rose from the draconian section. Are you suggesting, Dendrick asked in a voice that had climbed several octaves above his usual bass rumble, that our current governmental system is temporary? All governmental systems are temporary. That's rather the point. They're tools for organizing society under specific circumstances. And when those circumstances change, the tools need to be updated or replaced. The civilizations that survive are the ones that manage these transitions consciously rather than waiting for catastrophic collapse. Another hand shot up from the mid-rim seating area. But what about species that have maintained stable governments for millennia? Stagnation isn't stability, the human responded. It's usually a sign that external pressures haven't reached critical thresholds yet, or that the system has become so rigid it can't adapt to changing conditions. Those tend to produce the most dramatic collapses when change finally comes. Professor Blackthorn made a sound that might have been an attempt at scholarly rebuttal, but emerged more like air escaping from a damaged atmospheric processor. His carefully structured understanding of galactic civilization was experiencing what could only be described as cascade failure. Let me see if I understand correctly, he said slowly. You're claiming that your species has developed theoretical frameworks for predicting and managing governmental transitions. We've had to, the human said with a slight shrug. We kept making the same mistakes over and over again. Eventually some of us started paying attention to the patterns and writing them down. It doesn't prevent bad decisions, but at least we can recognize them more quickly and course correct before things get too catastrophic. The holographic timeline flickered again, and this time several students noticed that the displayed period of galactic history suddenly looked remarkably brief compared to the temporal scales the human was casually referencing. 5 centuries of carefully documented political development began to seem less like the foundation of galactic civilization, and more like the opening chapter of a much longer, more complex story. Perhaps, Professor Blackthorn said in a voice that suggested he was grasping for any remaining thread of academic authority, we should postpone the examination until we can properly contextualize these additional perspectives. The human tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to deliver the final blow to whatever remained of the Academy's intellectual confidence. That's probably wise, she said gently. After all, you wouldn't want to test students on universal galactic history when you've only been teaching them about the current local government's brief administrative period. The sound Professor Blackthorn made in response would later be transcribed in official records as academic distress vocalization, though those present would remember it more simply as the sound of centuries of institutional pride deflating like a punctured spacecraft hull. The aftermath of what Academy administrators would later euphemistically term the perspective enhancement incident unfolded with the kind of bureaucratic chaos that occurs when institutions discover their fundamental assumptions have been constructed on foundations of crystallized ignorance. Within hours of the Human's impromptu lecture, emergency faculty meetings were convened across 17 different time zones. Subspace communication networks burned through their allocated bandwidth carrying frantic academic consultations. And Professor Blackthorne was observed in his office, staring at his wall of degrees and honors with the hollow expression of someone who had just learned that his life's work qualified him as an expert in a subject that apparently didn't exist. The examination was not merely postponed. It was suspended indefinitely while a hastily assembled committee attempted to determine whether the Academy's entire curriculum needed to be reconstructed from scratch. The committee's initial findings were not encouraging for anyone invested in the institution's reputation for comprehensive scholarship. "We appear to have confused Galactic with recent," admitted Dean Forthright, a dignified Centaurian whose three-chambered brain had evolved specifically for academic administration, and who was therefore uniquely qualified to recognize institutional disaster. "Our universal history program has been focusing exclusively on the last 500 years of galactic political development, while completely ignoring thousands of years of relevant precedent from individual worlds." The human who had somehow transitioned from problematic exchange student to involuntary consultant found herself seated at a conference table surrounded by the galaxy's most distinguished historians, all of whom were regarding her with expressions ranging from desperate hope to barely concealed panic. The irony was not lost on her that beings who had spent centuries studying the evolution of galactic civilization were now seeking guidance from a representative of a species they had previously considered too primitive for serious academic consideration. "The real issue," she explained with the patient tone of someone who had grown accustomed to being the only person in the room who understood the scope of the problem, "is that you've been treating your current government as the culmination of political evolution, rather than just another step in an ongoing process. It's like studying astronomy by only looking at stars that appeared in the last few centuries and then claiming you understand the universe." Around the table, distinguished academics began making notes with the frantic intensity of first-year students trying to avoid failure. The Christodian representative had abandoned all pretense of geometric dignity and was simply recording everything in the desperate hope that mathematical analysis might eventually make sense of this cognitive disaster. "What we need," the human continued, "is a comparative approach. Every species here has thousands of years of governmental evolution in their historical records. The patterns are probably remarkably consistent across different worlds, because the underlying social and economic pressures tend to be universal, regardless of biology or technology." This suggestion triggered an outbreak of excited chatter as faculty members began making connections that should have been obvious centuries earlier. The Draconian representative mentioned ancient clan kingdoms that had consolidated into continental empires before fragmenting into city-states. The aquatic Xenothians bubbled about cyclic transitions between democratic ocean assemblies and authoritarian depth hierarchies. Even the notoriously secretive Ethereal Collective admitted to maintaining detailed records of their own governmental metamorphoses spanning several millennia. "So what you're proposing," Dean Forthright said slowly, "is replacing our universal history curriculum with something more universal. Comparative governmental evolution," the human suggested. "Instead of teaching students about one specific political system, you teach them to recognize patterns, predict transitions, and understand the underlying forces that drive change. It's more practical, more intellectually honest, and significantly more useful for species trying to navigate their own political development." The committee spent the next several hours discovering just how limited their supposedly comprehensive educational program had been. The Academy's library systems, they learned, contained extensive records from thousands of worlds detailing millions of years of political development, but these archives had been classified as local interest materials rather than core curriculum. The galaxy's leading institution of higher learning had been sitting on the most comprehensive database of comparative governmental evolution in known space, while teaching courses based on a single 5th-century data sample. Professor Blackthorne, when he finally emerged from his office, had developed the slightly unhinged expression of someone who had spent too many hours re-evaluating fundamental assumptions about reality. "I've been reviewing our archived materials," he announced to the committee. "According to our own records,
At least 47 member worlds have experienced Republican to Imperial transitions within the last 2 millennia. 31 have undergone imperial fragmentations followed by federal reconstruction. 18 have maintained stable monarchical systems through systematic constitutional evolution. And none of this was considered relevant to galactic history? The human asked with the kind of gentle curiosity that made the question hurt more than accusation would have. We classified it anthropological curiosity, Professor Blackthorne admitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone confessing to academic malpractice on a galactic scale. The solution, when it finally emerged from weeks of committee deliberation and faculty soul-searching, was both elegant and revolutionary. The Academy would restructure its entire approach to historical education, creating new departments of comparative political evolution, cyclical governmental analysis, and predictive institutional modeling. The human was offered a permanent position as the founding director of these programs, with the kind of tenure package typically reserved for beings who had revolutionized entire fields of study. The new comprehensive examination, when it was finally administered months later, bore little resemblance to its predecessor. Instead of requiring students to demonstrate mastery of a single governmental transition, candidates were asked to analyze patterns across multiple species and time periods, identify potential future developments, and propose strategies for managing political evolution proactively, rather than reactively. The exam's final question captured the transformation perfectly, given the cyclical nature of governmental systems, and the current indicators of institutional stress in the Galactic Republic. What historical precedents are most relevant for predicting likely future developments, and what preventive measures might be implemented to ensure smooth transitions rather than catastrophic collapse? Professor Blackthorne, who had somehow managed to rebuild his reputation by enthusiastically embracing his own ignorance and becoming one of the new curriculum's most effective advocates, often concluded his revised lectures with a reflection that captured the essential irony of the entire episode. The Academy's greatest achievement was not teaching universal knowledge, but discovering how little we knew about the universe we claimed to understand. And somewhere in the faculty archives, filed under historical institutional transformations, a notation recorded that the Galactic Academy of Higher Learning had experienced its own unexpected transition from an institution that taught about governmental evolution to one that had actually undergone it all because a single student had asked which history they were supposed to be studying, and no one had thought to consider that there might be more than one answer.